Welcome to Unit 4, U.S. Economic Growth, Section 1, Industry and Transportation. I love this unit. I love the next two units. I love all this topic about American growth and finances. I think it's fascinating to see how America grows and some of the great leaders that were just captains of industry. I also like discussing the work that workers did and their fight for equality and for treatment and pay. And so this is a great couple units here, Unit 4 and 5. So in this section, Industry and Transportation, we're talking about the very beginning of the United States and how it's transitioning from a primarily agricultural economy and moving into an industry and transportation industry. Thomas Jefferson really wanted, when he bought the Louisiana Purchase, really wanted the country to stay primarily agriculture. Alexander Hamilton wanted it to become more like England, a booming business. And unfortunately for Jefferson and fortunate for Hamilton, they guessed it right. The country became a huge powerhouse of industry and transportation, and agriculture, although a very important aspect of the U.S. economy, did not become the leading part of the economy. It eventually took a back seat. Okay, so really critical section here. Okay, here's our objectives. Our focus question: what do businesses and companies do that fuel economic growth? So what do businesses and companies, what are they doing that makes it so the economy is either doing really well or doing really poorly? Our first objective was what influenced and prompted new technological advances? Second one, how did working change in the US and what were the consequences? Objective 3, why do we call this a revolution? And objective 4, who are the key people that were involved in this revolution? So if we come back here, first and foremost, what prompts, so in objective 1, we're just wanting to know what makes people come up with new items. Why does the United States continue to have one of the leading roles in new innovation and new technologies in the world? Why do we have, companies like Microsoft and Apple and Google and Facebook and all these other companies? Why do they originate in the United States? Why aren't they all over in some other country? Objective 2, how did work change in the U.S. and what were the consequences? So working for the family becomes significantly different than it was before. And what are the consequences, good or bad, for that? Objective 3, why do we call this a revolution? We think about the American Revolution, other revolutions like that, the French Revolution. Why do we call this a revolution? And objective 4, who are the key people that were involved in this revolution? So who are some important people that we should remember? Okay, so if you think about what I call the musts of transportation, there's lots of different things. Now, this was a list actually compiled by kids. I just asked in class. And so if I asked you, in order to have a successful transportation, you, let's say, are making a new business and your business is transporting things, either people or cargo or goods or whatever it is. What are things that you would need to have? Well, in this list, the class former to you guys said laborers. You need people to run the actual work. You need people to actually do the stuff, the actual moving of the stuff. They talked about efficiency and inefficiency. They talked about its process, its speed, I think it's supposed to say tracking. It's multiple areas of different things. It's fuel, the efficiency of itself. How does it run? Another one was careful, safety, security. If people are stealing stuff from you, if your product is not safe on it, or if the people aren't safe, nobody's going to want to travel, right? And good prices, fair prices, prices that people can actually afford, not prices that are ridiculously high that you can't ever afford. Okay? So they come up with this as the must of transportation. What other things can you consider a must of transportation? The reason we're talking about transportation is that is one of the single biggest factors. In fact, when we start talking about the first robber baron or captain of industry, the first wealthiest man in the U.S. at the time, is going to be the Vanderbilts. And the Vanderbilts are going to be, the reason they start to initially get wealthy is because Cornelius, he recognizes the ability that transportation has. He realizes that transporting products from one place in the country to another is going to be a huge industry. And so, with that being said, transportation and new forms of transportation are going to be a very important thing. So first and foremost, the first forms of transportation were roads. Roads obviously make a lot of sense. We use a lot of roads today. But roads are incredibly slow going. And I don't mean like going on the road. I mean like building the road. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how you built a road back in the day. Now it's so in a lot of ways similar to how we build roads today, but definitely different. First and foremost, you went and you cleared off all the debris. You had to get rid of trees, boulders, brush, all that kind of stuff. And you didn't have machines to do this. You had to have this all done by horses and hand labor, people, men, going out and working and declaring this stuff. Second, you used what's called a leveler. And this is similar to what we have today, right? This would be a scraper or a rake, basically, that would level the ground so that way the road was sitting on a nice level surface instead of a, really unlevel surface. Today we have big, huge scrapers, right? Scrapers that go and they can level huge amounts of land very quickly. And they're hydraulically controlled and all sorts of other things. On the other hand, rakes in themselves, they didn't have these powers, right? They had horse team wagons that would do this, which was really good, still better than hand labor, but it was still a lot of work, a lot of man hours in that, and a lot of horse hours. They used what was called a gunter chain. Gunter chain was an iron chain that was 66 feet long, and if you took 80 of those chains and put them together, that would equal 1 mile, and if you took 10 of them and put them into a square, that would equal an acre. Okay, and that's how they organized all of the different zones for roads, and also its different dimensions and different aspects that way. They used gunter chains. Then after that, the company that would do it, these were not owned by, these roads were not like, you think about a road and you say, who owns the road? Most of us realize that it's owned by the government now, right? State, county, or possibly even federal people. However, at this time, these governments are not owning this.
Please excuse the interruption. We need to release the girls' basketball teams to head to their games. Good luck, girls.
Instead, the federal government and the state governments usually hired out a private company to do this. So the private company owned the rights of the road. They usually would charge what's called a turnpike. A turnpike was a toll booth, basically. You'd be driving down the road and you'd have to stop. And when I say driving, you're not obviously using, any modern car at this time. You'd be on a horse or carriage or other thing like that, and you'd be going down the road, and at some point you'd have to get off and you'd have to pay a turnpike in order to use the road. Now, this is how the companies made their money. They had these taxes, these turnpikes, where people had to pay money in order to access the road. Okay, that might seem crazy, but at the time, the company's the one that made the road. They're the ones that did all the investment of the road. They want money back. And so roads are really this great new means. It's a straight, usually straight, um, path that leads to the area you want to get to. But the problem with the road is that it is, you can only take so much product at a time. You can only go so fast, and not to mention the fact that the roads themselves, were owned by these companies and would usually charge a pretty high rate to use them. These turnpikes, like I said, they're these large toll roads where they collected revenue. They didn't make lots of money, and they did make travel much faster, and it did lower transportation costs, but it didn't make transportation costs so significantly less that it was worth it. So the roads was not the best form of transportation. It was way better than what it was before, but it was not the best. The first national road or major road that connected different parts of the country were from Maryland to Ohio River in 1818. That's the first national road in the country. I kind of have these two little arrows that'll show you kind of where they go, from where they start and where they end. So after that, this is going to be one of the biggest transformations of transportation. And this is where Cornelius Vanderbilt gets rich. He recognizes that this is going to be changing, and so he doesn't invest in roads. He doesn't start roads. He goes into the steamboat company. Robert Fulton could design the very first commercially successful steamboat, and he called it the Clermont. And here's kind of a little artist picture of what the Clermont would have looked like. These engines of steam would go up and down rivers, large canals, or even across the ocean. Okay, they were much, much faster than roads were, much faster. They, for instance, to give you an example, went from New Orleans to Louisville, Kentucky, and it took 4 months by riverboat. Now, a riverboat would be a boat that was either pulled by a horse on a path by the river, or it would be just a riverboat, like just an actual boat on a river. That would take you 4 months to get from one place to the other. Because of the steamboat, that same trip took 20 days. So you cut your time significantly. And as it got better, as the steamboat even got better and better, it took actually just 6 days. The Atlantic took from 20 to 50 days, which could be over 2 months then long, to 10 to 14 days. So the steamboat is a huge deal, and Cornelius Vanderbilt really sees this and starts to build up a big business in this area. Steamboats were very, very effective. If you even look at steamboats themselves, it went from 230 in 1834 to just less than 10 years later to 700. So they grew huge. Because of that, they need to have major canals, right? You can't have a steamboat go anywhere without a big canal. And so that's going to create a new industry itself. And this is one thing that's really demonstrates how businesses fuel and develop an economy. They do so because the steamboat itself, great new invention, great new thing, but they're causing another industry, canal digging, ditch digging, right? People needed to make these canals so that the steamboats could actually go to areas they never have been before. So mostly these canals are in the northeast. They were able to link out all sorts of cities in different areas like that. The very best and most famous canal is the Erie Canal, and here is a little plaque of the Erie Canal when it was first created in 1827. Okay. It was completed in 1825. It ran from Lake Erie to the Hudson River. It opened up officially on 1827, 2 years later. Freight for you, if you were to ship something down that originally, would cost you $100. Now it costs you $4, significantly less, right? This is the power of transportation. This is what's going to make Cornelius Vanderbilt one of the richest men ever. This made New York the New York we think of today. It made it the commercial center, the big powerhouse. They linked canals up into New York, and it was huge. Look at the population numbers. In 1820, 124,000 people lived in New York. By 1860, so you have 30 more years. Sorry, 40 more years. You had a population increase of up to 800,000 people. Okay, and so this is going to be significant to New York and to other commercial centers. But Cornelius Vanderbilt was a genius. He eventually saw his business was taking off in the steamboat industry, but he knew there was this other invention, and he knew that there's this other form of transportation. It had been around for a while, it wasn't brand new, but it had just never been really utilized yet. And that's going to be the locomotive, the railroad. And so Cornelius Vanderbilt decides to sell all of his business in steamboat and start buying this new form of transportation that nobody was really involved in yet, called the railroad industry. These steam-powered engines would pull heavier loads and weigh more stuff than by horse or by steamboat. The railroads cost less to build. Think about the cost of a steamboat. You have the cost of actually building the boat itself, but then you also have the cost of the canals that you have to dig so it can go places. But in the railroad, all you have is, the cost of the railroad itself, which is, yes, expensive, the train itself, I should say. But the actual railroad, the track is fairly inexpensive. You just need rock, and you need wood ties, or railroad ties, and steel, and just some large nails, and that's all you need. They were significantly easier to build than canals. Canals, you had to sit, and there's so much digging and more digging. Where railroads, you didn't have that problem. They are the fastest form of transportation, by far faster than anything else. The steamboat wasn't even as fast as they could, and they carried significantly more weight. To give you guys an idea of this, in 1830 there was only 13 miles of track. By 1860, so 30 years later, there was 31,000 miles of track. So railroad insanely grew, crazy grew. 2 days it took to travel from New York City to Detroit, where that same trip would have usually taken 28 days. So from getting to New York to Detroit took 28 days, just shy of a month. Now it only takes you 2 days to get there. So railroads were huge. They were a big deal. Now, a lot of these railroads and these other things are looking for new commodities that they can transport, things that they can move from one place to another. This is going to be the influx or the push for industry, factories being built and other things like that. And this is what causes the Industrial Revolution to just transform manufacturing in general. This first started in Great Britain. It did not start in the United States. It developed from machines, that's why we call it industry. And these steams powered machines would be next to a river where they could get the power by the flowing river itself. And these machines replaced work that had been done manually before. So you have less and less need for manual labor, and you have more and more need for energy and fuel for the machines. One of the very first ones was Slater's textile mill. Samuel Slater, who was actually a British-born citizen, he moved to the United States. He had this idea, he had a new invention, and he didn't feel like the British took him seriously enough, so he decided to come over to the United States. In 1793, he went to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and Slater built his very first textile mill. And here's a little picture off to the side here for you. The machines were powered by the rivers and produced cotton. What they did is they just took the cotton and they put it into a fabric so that it could be actually used. Think about it like you have manufacturing where they actually make clothes, but in order for them to make clothes, you need to have the actual fabric to do it. So he took the raw resources like cotton and he turned it into the needed fabric so that way we could make things from it. At this time, they're going to use what's called the family system. This is where everyone in the entire family would live, work together at the mill. Everyone's there. Why? Because everybody needs the money and everybody is trying to work together to bring as much money in as possible. But Slater is going to take off. He's going to do very well for himself. But there's going to be people who are going to take his invention and they're going to build onto it and they're going to make it even better. One example of that is Lowell. Lowell made mills, and he said, instead of me just making the fabric, I'm going to make everything in this one factory. So that way, because if you're a business and you're trying to make something, and you have to go to Slater and then take his fabric that he's made for you, you have to take it somewhere else for them to actually make the clothes with it, that's an inconvenience for you. It's inefficient and it costs more money because you've got to move it from one place to another. But Lowell comes and he says, no, I'm going to take all of your product and I'm going to take it and make everything one. I'm going to do a one-stop shop. It's kind of like markets. Before there was Walmart, you had to go to all sorts of different stores to get the things you needed. You had to go to the hardware store, you had to get the food, you had to get all sorts of different things. Now at Walmart, you have everything in one place. It's incredibly convenient. So that's what Lowell does. He decides he's going to have all of this in one place. And he's going to change the way that we are doing business. He powered his mill by the Merrimack River and built several factories along this river. But here's one thing that's very different from him. Where Slater was using the family system, he decides to hire young farm girls to work. Now you might be like, what the heck? That's kind of creepy. And maybe it is, but it wasn't creepy in that way of like he was doing something inappropriate. What he was doing was he'd hire these farm girls that were young, and these girls, instead of going and working at Slater's and then going home and kind of being a nuisance, he would take them in, he would house them, he would clothe them, and they would work all the time for him. And then the money that they made would be usually given to their fathers. And so this was going to be a significant help to families, and it changed everything about the way that Lowell did things. These girls worked until they got married. Once they were married, they could leave if they wanted to. They were under very strict what's called behavior rules. They never were allowed to go to town by themselves. They always had to dress a certain way. They had to act and behave a certain way. So that way they were not being silly or getting themselves into trouble. And so these girls become called Lowell girls because they work for Lowell factories. These Lowell girls are going to be very important in our future of talking about workers' rights and labor and hours and all sorts of things. So family life is going to change significantly. Like we talked about, machines made the labor and took a lot of the jobs that were needed, and this made a lot less need for skillful jobs. Think about a cobbler, a person who makes shoes. These guys, they have a very high and important skill that they're doing. Very good craftsmanship to get a master cobbler, right? Now, all of a sudden, if we have a machine that can do this, the quality might not be as good, but it can make it a lot cheaper, a lot faster, making it so that way you benefit from the machine. The problem with that is now the cobbler doesn't have a job. So the employers were happy in some ways because they could pay workers, or I'm sorry, not the employees, the employers were happy because they could pay workers less and less money. Women could work not only at like a factory, but they could go home and they would sew shoes. This would earn them about $1 a week if they sewed shoes. Men could do several tasks like shoe carving and earn themselves about 50 cents a week. Now you might say, why the heck are the men getting paid less? Well, this is an example. Women sewing shoes is a higher craft. It's a harder skill to do, right? Men just cutting shoes into a certain shape and then doing it in a very fast fashion with machines and stuff is going to be very, very cheap. And so it's going to be less expensive. So these are some new inventions that are going to shape agriculture. We've already talked about transportation and other things like that, but there's also some new inventions that are going to take shape. Eli Whitney, perhaps one of the most famous inventors of the United States, um, really comes at this time during the Industrial Revolution, and he invents the cotton gin. Cotton gin is probably his most famous invention, although he also invented interchangeable parts and a bunch of other things. This idea was that he would be able to harness cotton a lot faster and get rid of the seeds a lot faster to make it so it's more productive and more efficient for businesses. When he did the irreplaceable or interchangeable parts, what that meant was, think about every time something breaks. If you had to go to the store every time and just rebuy a whole new thing, that was how it was before Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney said, you know what? All they need is one little simple part. And so he created an industry where people could make the parts and buy the parts, so that way they could um, they wouldn't have to go buy a new product. One example of this is Elias Howe. Elias Howe created the sewing machine, and then he perfected it, or it was perfected by Isaac Singer. You may have heard of Singer sewing machines, which are a very, very famous sewing machine. This made production incredibly faster. Now, people were not buying sewing machines in huge numbers, but what they were doing is factories were buying them so that people could sew more and more all the time. Samuel F.B. Morse created the electric telegraph, and he would send these electric signals to people using a series of dash and dots that you probably know is called Morse code. As he would do this, he was able to send the first telegraph in 1860, and it created 50,000 miles of telegraph lines because of that business. Now, this transforms communication. Think about it. This time, people are communicating simple um, through simple letters. That could take months for somebody to get the letter that you wrote. Now you have a telegraph. These telegraphs were not in people's homes for the most part. They were instead in trains or other things like that, where people could go to a train depot and get messages that were sent to them. They would be called telegraphs, I guess. And John Deere also created the steel plow, and this helped people farm a lot better and a lot more than what they had been able to before. And then our last one is from a guy named Cyrus McCormick. He created the mechanical reaper. Up to that point, people had been cutting and harvesting fields by hand, and he's able to create he was able to create the reaper. Now here is a diagram of interchangeable parts. Think about all the little components that go into a gun. Here's an example of an industry that benefited greatly because of Eli Whitney and his interchangeable parts. Here's a Singer sewing machine. These would have been all over, hundreds of them in factories for people to see and people to use. Here's a telegraph, one that would have been at a train station. And here's John Deere's steel plow. And here's Cyrus McCormick's reaper. It might look primitive now, but that machine right there changed farming forever. Okay, so that's the end of our notes there. If we go back here to the beginning, we can see the answers to our objectives right here. First and foremost, what influenced and prompted new technological advances? We can see that businesses and transportation did. Transportation was what influenced new technological advances, because in order for transportation to be effective, they had to be able to transport items from one place to another. How did work change in the US? It went from a family system to a more unskilled, more unskilled labor, and it also went from the family system to having children working like in the Lowell factories and other things like that. Why do we call this a revolution? Because it changed dramatically. This wasn't really in your notes, but because it's an explosion of technology. It's an explosion of new industry that's coming about. Objective 4, who were key people that were involved in the revolution? Well, there was Cyrus McCormick, there was John Deere, Eli Whitney, all those people there at the end. Isaac Singer, and all of those, right? And that's the end of our notes. Thanks so much, guys. Have a good one.